Welcome back to another edition of State of Recruiting with John Garcia Jr. Today, we are going to talk about the race for number one, that being the number one recruiting class in the 2023 recruiting cycle. Joined by, as I said, John Garcia Jr. of SI All American. I'm Brian Driscoll from Irish Breakdown. John, this is going to be, in a lot of years, it's the same names over and over and over again. Every now and then a team like Texas A&M sneaks in last year, but this is an interesting cycle, John, because you have some of the teams in the top five that we're normally used to hearing in the top five: Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia's creeping around, LSU's lurking around. But this year, you look at the top 10, John, there's some new teams that don't often make that race for number one that we're going to talk about. So we're going to see some new faces, maybe some programs on the rise in this battle for number one. But I have a feeling this is going to be one of the more entertaining and debated, and let's see how they finish, races for number one that we've seen in quite some time.
And that's the beauty of it. Usually by this time, we're already saying, well, look, it's probably this team. Maybe this is one contender to challenge Team X. Team X usually being Alabama. Maybe Georgia's the contender, and it's kind of chalk for a given recruiting cycle. But yeah, Brian, this year it feels wide open. You've got, of course, Alabama sitting there. Notre Dame has sat there the longest of any program in this class of 2023. Texas is here, following that Arch Manning hype, buzz, momentum after that verbal commitment on June 23rd. Texas has creeped up and higher on the list. So it's really fascinating to look at. And of course, Ohio State is still there as well. So I think it's fitting that you've got, of these top four contenders for number one, you've got two from the old guard in Alabama and Ohio State. And then you've got two from, either a first or second year head coach, younger, who's really building something that feels a little bit different than the previous staff at each school with Notre Dame and Texas in particular. So a little bit of old and new blended together. There's, of course, the other outliers, as you mentioned. LSU, Clemson is still there. Georgia is still there. But even beyond those teams, Miami's in the mix. Florida is in the top 10. What if Oregon goes crazy on the field and starts to wrap up big recruiting battles thereafter? They've got a shot in a crazy dark horse world as well. So there's still a lot to be said. And that's the point of why you said it will be so entertaining. There's still so much to go in this class of 2023, even with 80% of the SI 99 recruits already off the board. You've got 18 still on the board. And then, of course, the flip game. How does that change come November, December, and when we get closer to that early signing period? So there's still a lot out there for a lot of these programs. So excited to dig into the names, the who's, the what's, and play a little hypothetical ball, which is something we're classically trained not to do. But this is CFB Nation, right? We get to do what we want. State of recruiting. Let's flip it upside down, dig into it inside out, just in time for the start of the season.
John, it's an interesting thing you brought up there. You talk about the players that are already committed. There's only 18 of the SI99 that are uncommitted, which I'd be curious to see what that was last year, because I kind of felt like going into last year, after the COVID year, visits opened back up. It seems like a lot of kids were in a rush to make a decision. There's a lot of kids that have made decisions now, but there's still a good number of kids, not only the 18 in the SI99, but as I was talking to you about, who are the next in line guys kind of beating down the door to jump in the SI99. A lot of those kids are uncommitted. And then also with NIL, we're talking about the flip game. Penn State's class, for example, looked a whole lot different a month ago when you look at some of these kids like Tamorian Parker and the quarterback out of Texas or out of Florida that flipped to Florida. So between those uncommitted kids and the potential flip game with NIL, do you think that even adds more to what the shakeup at the top of this recruiting battle and this recruiting race could look like?
Of course. How could it not, right? Because a lot of that stuff will become more clear for the programs, right? As the season wears on. Remember, like you said, this time last year, kind of boring, right? A lot of kids wanted to make that decision before their senior season began. They did. They were committed. And now it was like, okay, sit and wait. And then boom, craziest coaching carousel of all time started happening, and then everything was upside down in every element of college football, including, of course, recruiting. So I don't think we see that craziness because of the carousel, but NIL could have a similar kind of bombing effect to where the ripples of it hit and touch programs coast to coast. And we've seen conference realignment factor into that as well. I think a lot of visits are going to happen later rather than sooner, including with many kids who are verbally committed. Malachi Nelson was at Texas A&M. There's talk he might take other visits as well. And this is a kid who's been tied to Lincoln Riley since like his sophomore year of high school. So there's kids who are, even those seemingly comfortable and done with the process, that are still keeping the door just slightly open. And obviously, when you're talking about these big time college football programs, that's all it takes to create an opportunity and eventual movement within a given recruiting class. So yeah, there still could be a lot ahead for this class of 2023. So I think that's another reason why we've got so many contenders, right? When we play the hypothetical game, the on-field results are going to factor in, right? Particularly with Texas, of these 4 programs. If Texas, is on one extreme or the other, 10 wins or 5 wins like last year, I think you could see some movement where it's like, well, maybe the Arch Manning hype and all that wasn't enough to jump in with Texas. Let's kind of reshuffle the deck now that they are, a borderline bowl team versus a team that should contend in the Big 12. And then vice versa. If things go incredibly well for Texas, who's to say they don't shoot up all the way to number 1 in 2 months, after the Oklahoma game and all that kind of stuff? What if they upset Alabama? I mean, there's so many on-field factors that can factor in with the programs that are contending at the very top. So I think it's going to be fascinating in just about every way. But NIL is going to be that coaching carousel-like factor. And then the carousel will hit again, right? We know that's always going to be a part of it. The precedent of schools, particularly USC and LSU, moving on from their coaches early. I think USC was September. LSU wasn't very long after that. Moving on from them coaches early publicly, I think created a whole lot of divisiveness early on, but kind of worked out for those 2 schools, at least, comparatively. So I'm curious to see if that is a game plan that some of these ADs that are looking at coaches like Scott Frost, Brian Harsin, Mike Norvell, maybe Chip Kelly, some of these coaches that could be right on that bubble, if things don't go their way in September, do they pull the trigger early, to create even more chaos? So yeah, all of that stuff is going to factor into this chase for number 1.
And last year, you say it worked out well for USC and LSU in regard to they went out and got big-time coaches to be their new head coaches, but there were a lot of kids that were in those classes that ended up somewhere else when the dust settled, which again could impact that number 1 ranking. So that's what's going to make this a very, very interesting. What do we got? About 4 months left, John, before the early signing period, and then we'll have a couple months after that. But it's going to certainly be interesting to see how this chase and this race goes down.
100%. And like you said, it does go both ways, right? You have those Oklahoma class was really nice last year before Lincoln Riley's, move to USC, and that class was dismantled so quickly.
Florida's another one. Nick, the Evers kid, the quarterback that I know you were very high on, ends up going to Oklahoma from Florida. Florida's another one that kind of saw their class get decimated a little bit with some of the big names. So that's what I think is going to make this a really fascinating race.